In September 2016, the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, addressed the National Famine Commemoration in Glasnevin Cemetery, and with great emotion, he described Ireland's tortured relationship with the Great Hunger of the 1840s when he said, "For a very long time, it was something to which we could not give a name. It was something to which we were not able to engage. It was something that generated a great silence." The notion that Irish society struggled to deal with the legacy of the Great Hunger until the 1990s is pretty pervasive. The Great Silence is often used to describe a society traumatised by guilt, shame and sorrow, and left unable to talk about what had happened in the 1840s. Many even argue the famine was something of a taboo subject in Irish society. Now in this podcast, I'm going to pick apart this idea of the Great Silence and how Irish society handled the extreme trauma of the Great Hunger, because I'm not convinced at all there was a silence in Ireland in the aftermath of the Great Famine. Now, as usual, I like to frame the history around stories, so we're going to begin today's show in the most unlikely of places, with an Irish family in India in the 1850s. Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer. Now, before we get going on today's show, I just want to flag that my exclusive supporter series on the outbreak of the Troubles will continue this week as Dr. Brian Hanley and myself look at Bloody Sunday and its legacy. You can get that and the 4 other episodes in the series so far at patreon.com/Irish podcast. That's patreon.com/Irish podcast. Secondly, in a few weeks' time, I'll be starting a 3-part series on a forgotten victim of the Troubles. The current working title is 3 Days in July, and it focuses on the story of how a young Londoner came to die in Republican West Belfast in 1970. The release date for part 1 is Wednesday, June the 5th, but make sure you are subscribed to the show to get that episode. There has been a few issues with people being unsubscribed by podcast apps lately, particularly Apple Podcasts, so make sure you're following the show to get that series when it drops. Finally, if you have any feedback on today's show, do get in touch at info@irishhistorypodcast.ie. Now, let's start the episode by heading to 1850s India and the story of an Irish family, the Fitzgeralds. Sound on today's episode is by Kate Dunlea. James Fitzgerald could probably never have envisaged any of his descendants would transform Irish history. He himself was related to the aristocratic Irish rebel Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who had been killed in the 1798 rebellion, but James had pursued a very different path in life. His father had moved to India, settling in Nagpur, where James had been born in 1839. In the late 1850s, when he was still a teenager, James Fitzgerald had helped Britain subjugate the Indian subcontinent. In 1857, he played a part in crushing an uprising in India and was even awarded a medal for his service. Now, over the following decades, he would go on to live what might be described as a stereotypical colonial life. In the 1860s, he was married to a British woman, Emily Waypart, who had been born in Madras, and after his military career came to an end, the couple, as was common practice for similar families, retired back to Britain, settling in Tenby in the south of Wales. However, even in Wales, Fitzgerald continued to associate with people with a similar life experience to his own. After his first wife Emily died, he did remarry, but it was to a woman, Blanche Phillips, who had been born in another outpost of the British Empire in Asia, the city of Rangoon in modern-day Myanmar. Now, in the 1890s, James Fitzgerald would go on to have a second family with Blanche Phillips, and they would have a daughter, Cecil, in 1896. As Cecil Fitzgerald grew up, the British Empire was reaching its zenith, covering large parts of the world at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. However, Cecil would pursue a very different life to that of her parents. Initially, it did seem she was set for a life in the British establishment in the mid-20th century. To those who knew her, she came across as snobbish, and after completing her education, she married the well-known and wealthy London solicitor George Ivan Woodham Smith. They lived at Cadogan Place, where they counted the Prime Minister Harold Macmillan among their neighbours. While Cecil was a housewife, she was also passionate about history and literature, and when her children left home for boarding school, she began to pursue these interests. However, always wanting to keep up appearances, when she travelled to archives for historical research, she did so in a chauffeur-driven car. Cecil, however, was a very talented writer and a researcher, and by the 1950s she had established a reputation as a respected popular historian, having published 2 books on what might be considered imperial history, one on Florence Nightingale and then the other on the charge of the Light Brigade and military disaster from the Crimean War. Her talents were recognised and she was awarded and accepted an honorary title of Commander of the British Empire. All told, by the 1950s it seemed that Cecil was indeed firmly part of the British establishment. Now, while both her history books at this point had received critical acclaim, Cecil, known as Cecil Woodham Smith, took something of a bizarre career move in the later 1950s when she decided to write her 3rd book on the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s. Now, this was a strange choice for multiple reasons. It was clearly a departure from the imperial history that had served her so well. Furthermore, the famine was not the popular topic it is today. Indeed, she was entering into what was effectively a historical wasteland avoided by historians since the 1850s. Although it's now difficult to believe, in the century that followed the end of the Great Hunger, only 2 books specifically devoted to the subject had been written. The first book had been written back in 1875 by a Mayo priest, Reverend John O'Rourke, but by the mid-20th century it was long out of print. The release of that book had been followed by 81 long, silent years. Then finally, as the centenary of the Great Hunger approached in the 1940s, the government of the Irish Free State, led by Eamon de Valera, commissioned Irish academic historians to produce a history of the Great Famine. The book, however, would prove to be a testimony to what might be described as a general disinterest Irish historians had in the famine. It took 10 years to write, with the final version only appearing in 1956. The book also had a limited impact on wider society. It was an academic text written for and by academics, and in a country where only 16% of the population completed secondary school and less still went to university, most people would have struggled to read the text. Therefore, when Cecil Woodham Smith decided to write her 3rd book on the subject, one would be forgiven for wondering what, if anything, someone born into a family of British imperialists and a neighbour of a British Prime Minister would add to the debate. But Cecil Woodham Smith had another side to her. Although she was born in Wales, she considered herself Irish. She had a deep affinity with the black sheep of her father's family, the revolutionary Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who had been killed in the 1798 rebellion, and she drew inspiration from his life. Cecil herself had, on several occasions throughout her life, proven she was not afraid of taking unpopular stances. While attending Oxford University, she was suspended for demonstrating in support of Ireland during the War of Independence. Nor had this radical streak faded. She supported calls for the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the 1950s, which was at the time considered a crime. Now, clearly armed with a critical perspective on the world and a wealth of experience in writing and research, she pushed ahead into that historical desert that was the story of the Great Famine of the 1840s. It would take her a few years, but in 1962 she emerged on the far side with what would prove to be one of the most popular, widely read and influential Irish history books of all time. Titled The Great Hunger, Woodham Smith had produced a gripping narrative, laced with harrowing descriptions of the reality of life in Ireland in the 1840s that even today leaves a searing impact on the reader. In her approach, she was scathing of the British government, although it should be said not as much as is sometimes claimed. Most importantly, though, she laid out a history of Ireland in the 1840s, explaining what happened, and it was in a format that Irish people could read, relate to, and understand. For the first time in generations, there was an accessible book that detailed what exactly had taken place. The book would prove, as we'll see, to be extremely successful, and it would be reasonable to expect that Irish historians would finally start to engage with a topic central to wider Irish history, but one that had been neglected for over a century. However, the reaction of Irish historians, if anything, seemed to confirm the idea that there was indeed a great silence around the topic in general, and that Irish society didn't want to or couldn't engage with the history of the Great Famine. Irish historians, by and large, adopted a hostile and sneery attitude after the release of the book, and many rounded on Woodham Smith with critiques that often were reminiscent of comments on a bad Twitter thread. While there were many valid critiques to be made of Cecil Woodham Smith's book, the reactions of Irish historians was generally really petty. Having failed to provide the Irish people with an accessible book on the most important event in the island's history, they derided her efforts without acknowledging its many strengths. The historian and future provost of Trinity College Dublin, FSL Lyons, called it emotional and simplistic, words that you could use to describe his reaction to the book. In South County Dublin, Lyons' contemporaries in University College Dublin would go a step further. In an act that was downright rude, in 1963, final year history students were asked to write an essay on the topic, "The Great Hunger is a Great Novel." One of the foremost historians of the Great Hunger in the later 20th and 21st centuries, Cormac O'Grada, labelled this reaction sour grapes from historians, who Cecil Woodham Smith, after all, would outsell many times over. However, the general hostility, if anything, as I say, seems to confirm the notion that Irish society had a tortured relationship with the Great Hunger, and a combination of guilt and shame shaped an atmosphere where people preferred to forget rather than explore this difficult history. However, when we pull back and look at the reactions of the wider Irish public, not historians, this suggests a very different picture, because the wider Irish public loved the book. Indeed, it was not only extremely popular in Ireland, but it also did really well overseas, particularly in the US. At home, newspapers would serialise the text, and in May 1963, the first television programme on the famine, inspired by the book, was commissioned and released. Now, this show was actually a strange one. It was based around an actor playing the British civil servant Charles Edward Trevelyan, who Woodham Smith had singled out for particular criticism, and he was interviewed by a modern-day journalist. It would be amazing to see that today. On the far side of the Atlantic in the USA, the book was also a rip-roaring success in Irish-American communities. Although more research is needed, it probably did help shape modern Irish-American identity and attitudes towards Irish people in the US. It was released at a critical moment. John F. Kennedy had been elected president in 1960, and JFK was not only the first Irish-American Catholic to win the presidency, but also a descendant of a famine emigrant. He apparently had 6 copies of The Great Hunger for some reason. Aidan O'Byrne, an official in the Irish Embassy in Washington, at the time reported that Cecil Woodham Smith's The Great Hunger helped deepen understandings of Irish migration to the US. Now, this all questioned the notion that the famine was a taboo subject in Ireland. There was no question at all it was for historians, but all evidence suggested that wider Irish society had never really stopped talking about the issue. It wasn't something they talked about every day. It was, after all, 100 years in the past. But the idea that the Great Hunger was a taboo and never discussed at all makes no sense at all, as we'll see next. Rural Irish life in the later 19th and 20th century made little or no sense without knowledge or recognition of the profound impact of the famine. It shaped almost every aspect of life. Many, if not most Irish people, were living in a landscape of ruined houses and communities hollowed out by widespread emigration. Mass graves were known about. In the early 20th century, workhouses continued to have a stigma attached to them, which was in part related to the fact that hundreds of thousands of people had died inside these institutions in the 1840s. None of these things would have made any sense without a knowledge and recognition of the famine. It couldn't be a taboo that no one ever spoke about. But there is also ample evidence that it was regularly talked about. In the 19th century, severe food shortages and famine occurred on several occasions, right up to the end of the 19th century, and inevitably people used the Great Hunger as a comparison and a yardstick. In 1897, the 50th anniversary of Black 47, one of the worst years of the Great Hunger, coincided with Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and while Unionists in Ireland held celebrations for the Queen, others were keen to point out that she had been the reigning monarch back in the 1840s. In Skibbereen, there was even a commemorative event to remember those who had perished 50 years earlier. The Great Hunger was also invoked by Irish nationalist politicians as evidence of British misrule in Ireland, and even after independence in 1922, it was occasionally referenced in the Dáil in debates. Determining how often it was spoken about in wider Irish society on a day-to-day level is more difficult. However, in the 1930s, the Folklore Commission gathered stories from across the country, and the famine does feature in these collections. It was also the subject of the novel Famine by the internationally renowned Irish writer Liam O'Flaherty in 1937. This all suggests that the famine wasn't a taboo topic at all. Of course, there were aspects of the history that people didn't want to pass down, actions they weren't proud of, things they had done to survive that they didn't want to share with their children. But on the whole, it's very questionable to say that the Great Hunger was surrounded by a shroud of silence in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Now, as I've said, this shouldn't be a surprise. Hundreds of thousands of famine survivors were still alive in the early 20th century, while, as I've said, in many ways, it was the stage on which later 19th century history played out in rural Ireland at least. However, the custodians of our history, certainly in the 19th and early 20th century, that is, historians, were avoiding the topic, and it's worth exploring why this was the case. Now, the reasons probably varied over time. In Das Kapital, Karl Marx observed that the Great Hunger had a limited effect on the wider economy of the United Kingdom because, in his words, it only killed poor devils. One wonders if the same could be said for its impact on history in the 19th century. It had disproportionately impacted the poor, and historians of the late 19th century were unlikely to be drawn from the ranks of those who had suffered. Politics also played an important part. Many, not all, but many universities were unionist in outlook, and academics were reticent to criticise the British government, an approach which made it very difficult to research the Great Hunger. There's no question that politics shaped attitudes of historians in the 20th century. In the aftermath of independence in 1922, Irish historians in the Free State were increasingly influenced by a school of thought called Revisionism. Now, this is very different to revisionism elsewhere. It's not really about revising understandings of the past, but rather historians perceived themselves as a counterbalance to the nationalist propaganda they believed the Irish Free State was espousing. This certainly contributed to the bizarre situation where very few books were written on the Great Hunger, a subject that was seen by many as a Republican topic in history. Somewhat ironically, the silence of historians, if anything, would only serve to amplify the impact of Cecil Woodham-Smith's book that was released in 1962. As the only history of the famine available, it went through reprint after reprint. It sold at least 60,000 hardback copies, which is phenomenal for a book on Irish history. Perhaps the clearest measure of its success can be seen in the title of the book, The Great Hunger, which would become the phrase Irish people in general would use to describe the Great Famine. In that 2016 speech I mentioned at the start of the show, President Michael D. Higgins claimed, "For a very long time, it was something to which we could not give a name." Now, along with the notion of the Great Silence, that's very questionable as well, and I want to look at this because it helps understand the impact of Cecil Woodham-Smith's book. There had been terms used to describe the Great Hunger. The term drochail was a phrase used in Irish-speaking communities, but as the Irish language went into a crisis in the 20th century, this term did become somewhat problematic. It translates very poorly into English as bad life or bad times or maybe hard times, and the emotion infused in the words was lost. But the famine of the 1840s was also referred to as the Great Famine, the Black Famine, or the Famine of 47. The term an Gortha Mór, an Irish language phrase, was also used, although it wasn't in common parlance, it should be said, prior to the later 20th century. Now, Cecil Woodham-Smith would use a translation of that phrase an Gortha Mór in her title, The Great Hunger, and it would become the most popular term used to describe the famine after the release of her book. In what is a bit of a sidetrack, it's worth saying there was a controversy around that name when it was released, although it's not the one you might expect. Irish people familiar with the words The Great Hunger would probably have associated them with the epic poem of Patrick Kavanagh by the same name that had been released in the 1940s. The poem is not about the Great Hunger, and Patrick Kavanagh was outraged and went on to accuse Cecil Woodham Smith of stealing his title and claimed it had never been used in reference to the famine. Now, he was either lying or ill-informed when he said this. As I mentioned earlier, it's a translation of the term Angurtha Moor, a phrase which had been in use in the early 20th century, if not before, and can be found in the collection of the folklore commissions gathered in the 1930s. The English translation had also appeared in print in history books that mentioned the famine in passing. I found at least 3 books released between 1910 and 1920 that used that phrase, the Great Hunger. It was also used in the New York Times review of Liam O'Flaherty's 1937 novel, Famine. I'm getting somewhat sidetracked here, but Cecil Woodham Smith didn't rob the title, but what she did do is popularise the phrase. If anything, though, all this just points to the fact that the famine was discussed prior to the release of her book in wider society, even if historians had ignored it. Now, while Cecil Woodham Smith's book was an outstanding success, the great silence of historians would not only continue after its release, but if anything, only got worse, and decades would pass before other historians would successfully build on the achievements of Cecil Woodham Smith. While Irish historians had largely ignored the famine prior to the 1960s, this attitude would actually harden in the late 1960s after the outbreak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. After the outbreak of the conflict, historians increasingly avoided writing anything that might be interpreted as history that was sympathetic to nationalist or republican narratives in Irish history. This approach would influence how the history of 19th century Ireland was interpreted. Revisionist historians increasingly argued the famine was not in fact the watershed moment it had traditionally been considered. Instead, they pointed to the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, which triggered decades of recession in Ireland. The historian Christine Keneally has argued that a form of self-imposed censorship was in operation, whereby people avoided writing anything that might be seen as supporting republicanism during the Troubles. Even when some historians did write about the famine, they adopted very strange positions. Mary Daly, a leading historian in University College Dublin, went as far as arguing that the British government could not be criticised for their actions during the 1840s because such a position would in effect be applying modern standards to the past. As she would suffer a devastating takedown at the hands of the Manchester-born literary critic Terry Eagleton for this argument. In his book Heathcliff and the Great Hunger, he pointed out that if Daly was correct, surely then we couldn't criticise practices such as witch burning, lunatic baiting, or child labour. Divorced from reality, past and present, most Irish historians had very limited influence then on the wider conversations that were happening around the famine. While Woodham Smith's book remained the only available history, novelists and artists influenced public discussions far more than the history departments of Irish universities. For example, the 1976 best-selling novel Trinity by the American writer Leon Uris told the story of an Irish revolutionary in the late 19th and 20th century, but placed the famine as central to Irish understandings of rebellion and politics. And while Uris might be an American, the book was hugely influential. It was an international bestseller that spent nearly 9 of its first 12 months after its release on top of the New York Times bestsellers list. At home in Ireland, the 1979 ballad The Fields of Athenry suggested the famine remained a topic that the Irish public had a deep interest in. Written by Pete St. John, it's a fictional story of a man transported to Australia for stealing corn during the famine. Various versions of the song reached the top 10 Irish music charts, with the most famous rendition by Paddy Riley remaining in the charts for over a year in the early 1980s. Marita Conlon McKenna's children's book Under the Hawthorn Tree, released in 1990, won multiple awards as well. All this is evidence that Irish people were willing to engage with the Great Hunger. Historians were the ones who were failing them. However, all this cultural output, be it books or songs, was no substitute for actual history. Historians, myself included, have frequently criticised songs such as The Fields of Athenry for simplistic narratives, but singers and writers, for that matter, are not historians, and they can't be expected to fulfil the role. They're writing literature or songs. The failure was all down to historians, and historians alone. But in the 1980s, this would begin to change. Eventually, a new generation of historians began to question the lack of research and analysis in the Great Hunger, and this would see some groundbreaking books released in the 1980s. Some of the first books were in the field of economic history. Among the most influential was Joel Mokyer's Why Ireland Starved, a groundbreaking book that placed the famine at the centre of modern Irish history. In 1988, Cormac O'Grada's Ireland Before and After the Famine, another economic history, a bit more accessible than Mokyer's book, but very much an academic text, also looked at the history that had been ignored for so long. O'Grada and Mokyer's books weren't the only ones, but they were notable for producing new and original research that broke free of dogma. However, their books were never going to become bestsellers. They were hard going at the best of times. You'd need a dictionary in one hand and something to mop your brow in the other when you're going to attempt to tackle some of these. And Cecil Whittam Smith remains the go-to historian, even if the book was increasingly outdated by this new research. Now, things would finally change in the 1990s. Among the first accessible and detailed histories was that produced by the Liverpool-born Christine Keneally, a graduate of Trinity College Dublin who published This Great Calamity in 1994, a highly accessible book which was, in Keneally's own words, designed to break the long academic silence about the famine. In another, shorter book, A Death-Dealing Famine, The Great Hunger in Ireland, released in 1997, Keneally revealed the pretty toxic atmosphere that had sustained the silence of history departments when it came to the famine, when she said that people who wrote history critical of British policy during the Troubles were, and these are Keneally's words now, accused of having a nationalist agenda or, more damningly, giving ideological bullets to the Irish Republican Army. The attitude of the historical community did change in the late 1990s. A combination of the 150th anniversary of Black 47 in 1997, which coincided with the peace process, helped loosen what Keneally had called self-censorship. In this atmosphere, growing numbers of historians began to focus on the area, and large amounts of research and books were published. The new research was, in general, pretty scathing in its critique of revisionist history in Ireland, which had tried to downplay the impact of the famine. While this renewed interest in the Great Hunger has continued over the last 3 decades, historians had serious catching up to do, and I still think we have a long way to go. Historians of the Great Hunger still have a limited impact over wider public understandings of the history of the 1840s. This is starkly obvious if we compare the influence of historians of the Great Hunger to that of historians of the Revolutionary era when it comes to public understandings of these respective events. In my experience, wider understandings of the famine remains pretty fragmented and disjointed. Indeed, the debate over what the famine should be called is probably a great testimony to the limited impact historians have on public debates. Even though every single historian of the period, in Ireland and across the world, rejects the idea that the famine was a genocide, it is a concept that has widespread traction. I've argued in a separate show that I think the term genocide is not a helpful way to understand the famine because it obscures what actually happened. But that's an argument for another day. My point here is about the limited impact historians seem to have on this debate. Now, historians of the present are not the ones to blame. However, 140 or so years of avoiding the topic up until the 1990s left a vast chasm between the history of the 1840s and wider public understandings of what had happened. For decades, historians had a very limited impact on the way the famine was remembered in Irish society. So, when people use the term genocide, I can see how this can happen. Even with all the latest research, it can be hard to get your head around what happened in Ireland in the 1840s. The scale of death can be difficult to comprehend. 1 million people died in just 5 years. By 1861, 1 in 3 Irish people had died or emigrated. Terry Eagleton, who I referenced earlier in the show, described the impact of this as being similar to a low-level nuclear attack. And in the absence of detailed history and the legacy of the Second World War, it's understandable that people would draw comparisons to genocide. Now, I have links in the show notes to that episode where I explain why I don't think it's a useful way to look at it. But my point is that I think all this is just a testimony to the failure of historians and their silence on the subject. To conclude the episode, I think the term Great Silence is really unhelpful. It implies a societal failing in terms of memory and understanding of the famine, but that's not what happened. I'm not trying to argue that the Great Hunger was something that Irish people talked about on a weekly basis, but it just wasn't a taboo either. What was happening is that Irish historians, not the wider public, refused to engage with the topic. Now that's where I'm going to leave today's episode. I'd love to hear what you think about this topic. You can reach me at info@irishhistorypodcast.ie. That's info@irishhistorypodcast.ie. Until next time, Slán.